Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today, we pay a visit to Tallinn.
Hello and welcome to the Center for Free Economic Thought in Tallinn. The Center for Free Economic Thought is the Estonian Business School's think tank devoted to the study of free markets in the classical liberal and Austrian economics traditions. The Estonian Business School has a strong focus on entrepreneurship in a digital world, and therefore the center focuses on the theoretical and practical approaches to the creation of value and the wealth of nations through entrepreneurship and innovation. Additionally, we cannot forget our history, as Estonia suffered the ravages of socialism for so many years, to later choose liberalism and finally develop into a leading entrepreneurial and digital society. On year 2021, we remember and celebrate the 30th anniversary of the independence of Estonia from the Socialist Soviet Union. At the Center for Free Economic Thought, we endeavor to foster a free society of free individuals through education and open discussion of ideas. Welcome to Estonia.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Free Market Roadshow event today. Thanks so much for joining us on this wonderful event for the FMRS in Tallinn. I'm Weiß, I'm the moderator of today's event. I'm a researcher at the Austrian Economic Center, which is the main organizer of the Free Market Roadshow. We already saw Juan just before me from the Center for Free Economic Thought, who is the co-organizer of today's event. Today we will discuss the topic of non-intended consequences of regulation and what we have forgotten since 1991, as Juan has just said, the 20-year anniversary this year from Estonia's independence. We will talk about the role, the place and the effects of regulatory policy, what we should think about regulations, which are, as we know, one of the favorite tools of policymakers in today's world. We will look at the situation of regulations in today's world and in today's societies, particularly in Estonia. I have three great speakers joining me today, two of whom I will really only introduce at a later point, Meelis and Hardo Pajula. For the moment, I'll just focus on our keynote speaker of today, who is Niels Carlson. Niels is the founding president and the CEO of Ratio Institute, which is based in Stockholm, Sweden. He is an economist and a political scientist, as well as a professor at Linköping University, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he's working in the fields of institutional economics, political theory, public choice, industrial relations, and constitutional political economy. Before I let Niels speak, I just wanted to mention that we would love to have any questions that might come up for you, the audience. So if you have any questions, then feel free to post them on whatever platform you are joining us, and they will in some way, in some magical way, show up on my screen, and I can then ask the questions to the speakers. But I think without further ado, I can basically hand things over to our keynote speaker, Nils Karlson. Niels, it's your turn.
So, hello everyone. I'm Nils Karlson at the Ratio Institute in Stockholm. I'm a professor of political science, but also an economist. And I'm going to talk today about the non-intended consequences of regulations, what we have forgotten since 1989. Back then, you know, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union fell apart, Eastern Europe became free, and I think we all agree that communism died. The belief in central planning, 5-year plans, well, collectivization of agriculture and so on, that became dead ideas. But the belief in regulations did not die, I'm afraid. So socialism, in the sense of a strong belief in interventions into markets and civil society is still alive. So just as Hayek, I'm going to talk to socialists in all parties, because I think these beliefs are just as dangerous as communism. And it's important to understand that rules, laws, are very important to the free society, to the open society, to the market economy, and to civil society, to independent communities, and to individual liberty, of course. We need simple rules in complex societies. And those simple rules concerns property rights, the rule of law, freedom of contract, protection of individual liberties, civil, political, and economic liberties, but also, of course, to protect liberty in general. So, given that we have these basic, simple rules, market, civil society will flourish. That's the basic idea from Adam Smith, Hayek, Karl Popper, and onwards. However, regulations is a different thing. Regulations are interventions into markets, into civil society, into communities, in order to reach specific outcomes. And I will give a number of examples here. And these kinds of interventions, regulations, they tend to produce self-enforcing processes that in the end contributes to unintended and often counterproductive consequences that are very dangerous to society. So in my own research, I've made a distinction between what I call two kinds of interventions of this kind that causes this kind of large-scale unintended consequences. And the first kind I call the logic of conceit. And this, I think, is the most important type. It concerns benevolent interventions. Politicians, voters, interest groups, they want to promote the good society, they want to promote social justice, they want to handle all kinds of social problems that we see in our societies. When it comes to inequality, when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to lack of housing, when it comes to all kinds of things that we don't think really work. So instead of relying on markets and civil society, well, many people want to interfere into those spontaneous orders, as Hayek called them, in order to promote these good things. So that's one type of interventions, one type of regulations. The other kind is what we may call the logic of opportunism. This is special interests, self-interested politicians, various groups in society want to promote their own interests, stifle competition, get benefits, subsidies, and things like that, privileges to their own group. These kinds of interventions, both kinds, usually starts with these good intentions. And let me give a couple of examples here. Rent control, something that most Western societies have, including Hong Kong, in fact, and many other places. Well, Hong Kong may not be that free anymore. But anyway, it was introduced because housing is such an important social good. Especially for poor people, it's very costly to live, to get a house, to get a rental apartment. Therefore, politicians, voters wanted to control the prices of rents to keep the cost down. So they introduced a price control in these housing markets. As a consequence, you started a process where, well, there became a lack of housing. More people wanted to have those cheap apartments, of course. So you constructed new social problems. Lots of people wanted more housing, so you started to subsidize the construction sector, for example. But then the inputs into the construction sector became more costly. You start to regulate those sectors. And you got a kind of self-enforcing process where one intervention caused new social problems, which legitimized new interventions and so on, in a very, very, very dangerous process, ending up with a larger states, more and more subsidies, more and more regulations. This is typical. Another example could be employment protection legislation. For example, you all know that youth unemployment is very high in Southern Europe, in countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece. Well, that's caused by these, from the start, very benevolent interventions. You want to promote security on the job. It's costly to lose your job, so people who have a job want the secure of feeling safe and secure. So they introduced legislation, interventions, regulations here to strengthen the position of people in their employment. Well, this of course in the long run gave consequences as companies not wanting to hire people because it became too risky to hire people with the wrong competencies, because it became too costly to fire them if they didn't, well, produce what was expected at the job. So this also in turn caused this kind of new policy-caused social problems, which, well, created a demand for new interventions, for new regulations. And you've had, in the end, as we have, not only in Southern Europe, but also in a country like Sweden, insiders and outsiders on the labor market, which is a huge problem, of course. We could take more contemporary examples here. For example, something that I've written about myself, which I believe is perhaps one of the biggest threats to liberty and to freedom in Europe at least. And that's the European social pillar of rights, the European pillar of social rights that the European Union wants to promote. And also with the support of most governments in Europe, and of course by the European Parliament. For example, they are now introducing a European minimum wage because they believe that wages are too low in some countries, such as Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and so on. So what happens is that, well, they increase the wage floor, which you cannot pay less than this. This means that unemployment will rise, of course, in those countries. And also it becomes a protectionist measure for workers in the richer countries in the West. So, and again, you start this process where a benevolent, perhaps benevolent intervention starts a process where you get these unintended consequences, policy-caused social problems, which after some time legitimizes new interventions, new regulations. And you get this process of an ever-increasing state. Kind of tyranny in small steps. Just to give a last example, over the last year, all of the world have seen lockdowns, restrictions on public meetings, restrictions on mobility, traveling, and so on. These kind of interventions will have the same, and they actually have already these kind of unintended consequences. So you see increases in mental health problems, you see, of course, rising unemployment, you see lack of economic growth, you see all kinds of things that will legitimate new regulations, interventions into markets and civil society. This is, as I said, often very counterproductive. It destroys the spontaneous mechanism, the ways markets work, the way communities work, the way civil society works. And in the end, you will have very dangerous long-term consequences. One such example, which occurred, if we go back to think about 1989, is that for a long time, for about 20 years after 1989, economic freedom in the world increased. the number of democracies in the world increased. But in the last few years, and this is very sad, economic freedom in the West have flattened or even fallen a little bit. You see the rise of populism, you see the strength of democracies being weaker. In fact, the number of democracies, the strength of democracy, according to Freedom House, Freedom of the World Index and so on, shows a very strong decline. And this process, in the end, I think, may cause what I've called the state of state. Many years ago, I did a book called The State of State, The Role of Invisible Hands in Politics and Civil Society, where I explain this mechanism more thoroughly and with many other examples. And such a situation, it's not communism, it's not central planning, but it's a society where the state has a dominant role over markets and civil society, over communities, over families. And that's a very dangerous situation that we should try to avoid. And therefore, I think these lessons that we learned in '89 of the problems of communism, of central planning, are lessons that we should learn from the works of Mises, Hayek, Adam Smith, Buchanan, and many others for the future of not only Europe, but for the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Niels, for these comments. Very thoughtful, and I think there's plenty to discuss later on. For the moment, I'll ignore you a bit to also bring in our other two guests with some introductory remarks. First of all, I wanted to talk with Meelis, who is director of the Estonian Business School. He also serves as a head of research at Foresight Center and previously worked as an advisor at the strategy unit of the Estonian Government Office. And he's also worked for the Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication. Meelis, you wanted to talk about the regulations and what we can learn from the COVID crisis as well, so I'll just leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Sky. It's a pleasure to be here. So very briefly, I would like to just, since we're talking here about reforms and changes that took place 30 years ago, I just very briefly wanted to highlight some of the policy reforms that were carried out in Estonia. And, as we're talking here about change in rules and change in regulations, then 30 years ago in Estonia, we had actually very radical and comprehensive changes. And perhaps before drawing some contemporary parallels, just to highlight maybe 6 areas of the reform. As was mentioned by a previous speaker already, there were quite radical changes in the rule of law. Property rights were established. And you have, what is quite important in this sort of economics of transition, you have a hard budget constraint from the early 1990s implemented. And this set of reforms has, also been documented very well in the academic literature, for instance, by Abrams and Fish from Berkeley. So sort of second set of reform that we carried out was about monetary policy. Obviously 30 years ago, we were in the ruble zone, and we introduced our own currency, and not just our own currency, but the whole system of mimicking currency board from the 1992 that was in place until 2011 when we joined the euro. And then we had a third set of reforms, quite important in the early 1990s, trade policy reforms. So we basically moved from very closed Soviet system, where was very little openness to the international global markets, to the unilateral free trade. which is quite unique in the sense that most trade policy in the world, most of the time, has sort of tried to follow some kind of logic of mercantilism. But unilateral free trade is relatively unique. We have seen that in the UK in the second half of the 19th century, perhaps in places like in Hong Kong or and so on. And we implemented that type of trade policy from the 1993 till we joined the European Union. And then you obviously have a sort of fourth set of reforms concerning fiscal policy, balanced budget, sort of very strong fiscal constraint, low level of government debt that we still have, even if it has increased quite rapidly as a response to the COVID. It's still probably one of the lowest in the world and the lowest in the European Union. And this has been also in the rule book since early 1990s. And then you also see sort of rapid and large-scale privatization from the 1990s onwards, which, in the 2000s, just to make a comment, and also more recently, has suffered some setbacks. Some of the companies that have been privatized have been later renationalized, but that was sort of modus operandi in the 1990s. And then you also get, particularly in the sort of second half of the 1990s, you get more and more sort of digitalization of both private and public sector services that sort of allows to have significant efficiency gains by cutting transaction costs and so on. So those are some of the most important changes, I think, that took place in Estonia. And in a way, I think they have served as a sort of springboard, what we have seen later, having this sort of very entrepreneurial ecosystem, lots of startups and so on. And I think they have been the most comprehensive we have actually seen, and probably the most radical we have seen in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, because in many places they had sort of similar types of reforms, but not perhaps as comprehensive. And some other places, they were probably not as fast as they took place in Estonia. And I think in many ways, it also offers us opportunity to think about this sort of current situation we are facing with the COVID pandemic. I think one sort of important lesson here is not so much what the reformers did, but it was more about how they did it. So they faced sort of severe uncertainty. However, they did carry out, they used this sort of uncertainty and complexity where no one was sure what will happen to make some quick radical changes. And I think also the COVID situation, in one hand, obviously it's a huge challenge, but it should be also seen as opportunity. It actually allows to change a lot of things. So instead of maybe subsidizing the old business models by government, which, as we discuss here, may have lots of unintended consequences, it would be possible perhaps to allow new business models to emerge and to kind of quite radically try to change economic structure, for instance, if it's feasible. And there are also some sort of smaller parallels that I can draw from how to carry out the reforms. I mean, for instance, just to maybe as a sort of last point, just to highlight some of them. For instance, in the post-socialist transitions, this introduction of some of the reforms, such as price liberalization or new currency, it had to kind of take place without announcing it in advance. I mean, some places they actually didn't do that. They announced that now in a week or so we will liberalize the prices. And obviously what happened was that everybody was gathering at the shops, trying to get up to cheap supplies, and immediately you had shortages. And I think with the COVID restrictions, the same story. I don't want to discuss here, what restrictions are good or what restrictions are bad, but it's more like if you decide to go for the restrictions, it's probably not going to help if you announce it, 1 week in advance, because then in those last days, people are trying to take the last opportunities. I mean, I saw it very well in my own local neighborhood most recently, where the pubs were shut down at 6 p.m. and they remained closed for weeks after that. And then just 30 minutes before that, some of them were quite full. Also, those vaccine shortages that we have seen in the European Union and we have seen here in Estonia, they actually bring to me alive some of the memories from the 1980s in Estonia, where people were gathering around the shops for all kind of goods, even stayed overnight and so on. And here we had a couple of weeks ago, there was one vaccine center around close to my house, and we saw a sort of similar situation where lots of people were just waiting to get vaccinated, even though that there was official government plan to vaccinate only the older generation. And also many middle-aged people gathered there for 3 days, and many of them actually managed to get vaccinated. So here we go. You have a official target of vaccinating older generation, but if you look at the data, then actually we have a very significant proportion of people in the middle age group who are not kind of target of the government, who have actually get vaccinated somehow. So those sort of plans talked up on the central level are not always executed the way the planners intend them, and so you end up with those interesting consequences. And maybe the last point, just to conclude, is that in those sort of what you can also learn from the sort of post-socialist transitions is that the reformers really took advantage of this surrounding uncertainty and used this sort of short window of opportunity. They didn't just carry out so-called shocks. We have this term shock therapy, but they also delivered therapy. I mean, soon the markets recovered, new companies emerged, there was enough goods for everybody, people had new opportunities to earn money and so on. And I think also in this vaccination story, we see that countries that have taken a radical approach, such as Israel, have actually been quite successful in vaccinating significant portions of their populations. And I think a couple of days ago, there was also in the Israeli newspapers this story that initially Pfizer was thinking about Estonia as a country where they could use a similar approach. But obviously, as in the European Union, we decided to do it together, then that kind of unilateral approach by Estonia was not obviously not feasible in this sort of broader context. And but I think the lesson here is that it's important to avoid in situations like that sort of traditional bureaucratic inertia of doing sort of very small changes in a kind of traditional bureaucratic way. So those are my introductory remarks. Thanks so much for listening, and I will be happy to discuss more with you in a little while. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Meelis. I think that was very helpful in laying sort of the historical groundwork of the Estonian example. And I think you made a really, really good point, namely that regardless of what we think about the restrictions on COVID, or the COVID restrictions, I was always repeatedly surprised also here in Central Europe how politicians always decide, okay, we will do, the situation is so dire right now, let's implement the restrictions in 1 or 2 weeks. And until then, it obviously got much worse. So that's kind of a weird thing that happened over the last year. Our last speaker is Hardo Pajula, who graduated in economics from the University of Cambridge and in 2016 founded the Edmund Burke Society. He has also translated books from prolific writers such as Friedrich Hayek, Ronald Coase, Roger Scruton, and Rupert Sheldrake. And Hardo is also the host of a podcast, an Estonian podcast, which I will not pronounce here because I will probably butcher the name. In English, it's Maps of Meaning. Maybe Hardo can mention what it means in Estonian, how you pronounce it, so that you can find it. Hardo, the floor is yours. Hardo, your mic is muted, I believe, so if you could switch that on, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, thanks. Yeah, in Estonian, the name tähenduse teejuhitaja. Whether that helps you or not is another matter. But the pronunciation is as I said. Well, in our previous email correspondence, I mentioned that I've had the feeling for the last 5 years that the situation is gradually resembling. Well, I mentioned that I have a feeling that we are kind of reenacting the end of 80s, and you kindly asked me to elaborate on that theme, so and that is what I'm going to do now in 5 short points. I first that sort of inarticulate feeling struck me perhaps 5 years ago when I was about to establish the Edmund Burke Society, and the feeling was that I've seen it already, or that there is a similar vibe in the air as it was in the mid, or rather at the end of 80s. And first, as I said, it was like a vague feeling, and I couldn't really make much sense of it. But then I started to ask in my public appearances from the audiences that let's suppose that there is such a thing as irritability index, general irritability index, whether local or global. That's again another matter, but let's look first on from local perspective. Assuming that there is, or that there were such a thing as irritability index, would you say that this has increased in the last years or not? And I'd say that 90% of the people would ask it, yes, it has increased. It has increased, and perhaps 60%. I mean, these are very. I didn't do obviously any formal statistical analysis of these answers, but I'd say that the 60 to 70% of people would say that this hypothetical index has increased considerably in the last years, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we are living in the long shadow of the financial crisis of 2008, and these are probably the key drivers in that general rise of bad mood, so to speak. One aspect of that is clearly the polarization, political polarization, and the other, which is even more, even closer parallel with the end of the 80s, is a loss of faith in the elites. I think these would be the first similarities between what I see with the present parallels between the present situation and the one that was at the end of 80s, and I would add now even one more thing to that, or the fourth point to that list of, and this would be the structural major structural break in the information technology. I think the last 25 or even 30 years have been characterized by the rise of the decentralized media, and this has as the decentralized media has taken ground from the centralized media, there has been a general dissolution of the general meaning making structures, and I think in that sense the situation may not be only similar with the end of 80s, but okay, let's put it that way, that if this revolution in mass media is of the same magnitude, and this point could be reasonably made, I guess, that the break in the information technology has been of the similar magnitude as that of Gutenberg in the 16th century, then our present situation may be even more grave than it was at the end of 80s, from which I started our remarks. So I think that would probably cover the short introductory remark. If you're interested, if that sort of provoked your interest, I can elaborate on that on these points further. But yes, just to recapture recapture these 5 points. First, I had just a feeling that there is a similar vibe in the air now as it was at the end of the 80s of the previous century. But there is a sort of general irritability rising, and one thing is clear, that this hasn't decreased in the last year with the COVID situation. I think it has to do with the consequences of the financial crisis of the 2008, and I would add to that profound revolution in information technology, which has brought down the general meaning-making structures of our society, and has led us to quite choppy waters, I think. So that would be it from my part for the introduction.
Thanks so much, Hardo, for your introductory remarks. And at that point, we are at a stage of going into the Q&A session. Just wanted to remind our audience that if you have any questions, then post them wherever you are joining us from. I don't know how it works, but somehow it will end up on my desktop in some beautiful ways. Feel free to ask any questions for the moment. I wanted to ask Niels first, that you kind of mentioned sort of a potential relationship between regulations and socialism. And I feel like there's a lot of, and you already kind of implied it, that if you introduce regulations, there will be a need of introducing many more regulations, one regulation after another, one more policy after another. And in that way, you could go down sort of the rabbit hole down to socialism, sort of going down the road to serfdom. And I was wondering, do you feel like there's a certain determinist element here, meaning that if you start with that, it will automatically go all the way? Or is it something that we can just have a few regulations here and there that might be sensible and that we can stop? Or are the unintended consequences always necessitating new regulations? And you're muted.
I control this myself, I think, so. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So let me make a number of comments here. I don't think there is determinism in this, but it's a constant fight. We always, all the time, there's like a pipeline of proposals coming all the time to make the world better or to benefit yourself through politics, you know. So there's a very strong belief from many groups that they could take advantage of the state to do things instead of relying on markets and civil society. And I think the case of Estonia is very interesting. I mean, you took the chance there in the early 1990s and did some very fundamental reforms because you picked up the good ideas. Some other countries did not do as substantive, important reforms as you did. Same thing with a crisis like now. It can go both ways, you know. Some countries will implement some good reforms. Most countries will not make any good reforms. They will make bad reforms. And listening to you before, I realized I took a look at the size of government expenditures in Estonia as a share of GDP. And they've been growing constantly for the last 20 years. And I'm sure the regulations have been growing constantly for the last 20 years. So even though you do good things, it's a constant fight, you know. And that fight, I've done a lot of work on how to promote liberal reforms. I have a book out called Statecraft and Liberal Reforms in Advanced Democracies. And my key message here is that what matters most is ideas. And tying on a little bit to this a bit pessimistic perspectives of Hardo here, also sense, I mean, we have this sense of insecurity, polarization, critique of elites, of course, and people are not really happy with how things are. But no one is providing a good alternative, really. So the bad guys take the opportunity here and promote interventionism, regulations. I mean, look around yourself in Eastern Europe. Look at Poland, look at Hungary. Look at many other countries, you know. It's a constant challenge here, and I think we have a job to do here. And I don't think we're doing that job very well, actually. So it's, I don't think we will have socialism, but we will have other kinds of problematic authoritarian regulations coming here if we don't do a better job ourselves. That would be my main message, actually.
That kind of begs the question almost. How can we do a better job?
Well, it's a question of a battle of ideas, basically. And we have to give people, try to explain how this open, free market society also gave better lives, better meaning, better opportunities, instead of these more nationalistic, more authoritarian, more collectivistic visions that socialism and communism provided, and that naturalism provides today. You know, it's I think a pluralistic liberal society creates better lives for almost everyone. You know, and we have to explain that. We have to make that understandable in a better way than we do today.
Right. So before going to
if I can also answer this question, that how we can do a better job. Yeah, obviously I agree that ideas matter and so on, and particularly in the long run. But I also would like to add that probably setting sort of positive examples is also quite important. You know, sort of doing sort of pilots, showing that it's possible to do things differently. And in the case of Estonia, again, like thanks for the comments, Niels, concerning the size of the government spending. I mean, overall, I would comment that you probably see some kind of paradigm shift. Let's say that you have this sort of 1990s reforms that I described. Then Estonia joins the European Union in 2004, and it's a shift in paradigm. For instance, I can personally have gone through this sort of natural experiment in a way that I lived most of my life in Estonia in 1980s and 1990s. But then for 2000 until 2010, I did not live in Estonia. I lived in London and Boston. And when I returned and started talking with people, I saw that people are talking differently than in the 1990s. I think the heroes of the 1990s were entrepreneurs, how bad or good they were. Some of them were really bad and so on. But I think heroes in 2010 were the guys who had made it to the European Commission and were now had sort of top level jobs. In parallel with that, you also saw sort of massive EU money flowing in, and obviously, I can say that some of them probably has been put into good use. I mean, you have better roads and so on. But in parallel, that you also have had sort of massive overinvestment, misallocation of capital, creating sort of perverse incentives for certain business models. Lots of unintended consequences as well, and also this sort of mindset change that we kind of have to follow the regulations. For instance, like as I mentioned before, our trade policy was completely unilateral. It was free trade, even agriculture, and then it sort of radically changes in 2004. when you join the European Union, you start getting all these regulations, and being a small country, and even if the government spending has gone up, and there are more and more government officials, I was one of them for 10 years, then you still have this sort of difficulties actually following and comprehending all those EU regulations and what they actually mean. We don't have the same government capacity as Germany or UK. For instance, I personally represented Estonia for 5 years in Economic Policy Committee of the EU, which is one of the subcommittees for the ECOFIN, for the finance ministers. But it was for me just like one of the many things I had to do, while my course mate from London, that was his full job, and he was part of the team of some sort of 5-6 people who did it on a permanent basis. So obviously in this context, you cannot comprehend or understand all this sort of regulatory overhang that you're sort of dealing with. And as a result, I think we have been very good and sort of implementing, maybe implementing better than EU is suggesting some of the regulations, putting them into practice, because it has been a sort of very simple thing to do for government officials without sort of questioning much. And a result is that you have all this sort of unintended consequences, like more broadly this sort of paradigm shift, sort of perverse incentives, probably like business models dependent on subsidies, misallocation of resources, and so on. Thank you.
I was actually, we got a question from the audience, which I think we can basically follow up with Meelis right away, but also Hardo maybe has some thoughts on it. You mentioned sort of having different models that worked, and Estonia potentially being one of them. We got the question, why was it possible for Estonia to become like a success story for the free market economy, whereas other ex-communist countries didn't really go down that path? What made Estonia special, if you want? And also what I was wondering about when you talked about it, if Estonia was so successful, why are people, in a sense, not more grateful potentially? Why do they actually want a change, perhaps, even within Estonia, even though they saw how successful the model was that was implemented in the 1990s?
Yeah, I mean, maybe starting with the last question. I mean, any kind of transition has a distributional impact. You have sort of political economy. I mean, some people gain, others lose. Obviously, if you were a farmer in the countryside, as my grandparents were working in the Soviet farm on top level positions, they were obvious losers because life in the countryside, radically suffered, while, maybe people who had an engineering degree and were involved in IT companies were the clear winners. So you have this sort of distribution impact, and people also sort of don't necessarily see the absolute gains, what they gain in absolute sense, but they see it as their position changes relative to others. I mean, that's always, I think, important. Even in absolute sense, there were obviously gains. I mean, if you look at per capita GDP, you have tremendous convergence. I mean, the Estonian GDP was something like 30% of the EU average in the mid 1990s, and sort of increased in 20 years to at least more than 2/3 of the EU average. So those are, and also sort of huge regional disparities and so on. And obviously, it's also kind of like this anxiety and nostalgia. Those are more like emotional, or let's say like less rational feelings, that people maybe don't remember all the bad things and remember some good things, and so on. So I mean, that's probably also quite important. As far as why was it possible in Estonia, again, like in one way, yes, in this sort of very radical transition, you do have heroes. I mean, you have people like Mark Lahr and others, sort of like young leaders who didn't. I mean, I'm not saying that they were well informed and very knowledgeable, but they just were not afraid to take tough decisions, and it kind of worked out. But in general, I tend to believe in sort of soft agency. I mean, we have also, let's say, better. I mean, soft agency in the sense that I don't overemphasize like one political leader. Particularly if you look at the transition in Estonia, the governments changed quite rapidly, and there was one governmental crisis after another, but there was sort of more broad consensus in policy making. But we also have a geographically good location. I mean, we are close to Finland, we're close to Sweden. So that certainly helped, opening up trade with the West quite quickly. And in many ways, we didn't also have much choice, for instance, in some areas, because you couldn't depend anymore on the Soviet system. So yeah, I would say, this is now a sort of traditional social scientist response. I would say that there is a little bit of agency, there is a little bit of structure, and then there is also good luck, basically, which is it was we were lucky in many ways, and obviously you also had pretty good reforms also in some other places like Latvia. They were a little bit like slower, but their reforms are relatively similar to Estonia's, and also Lithuania maybe. Also slower initially, and then Poland, Czech Republic, maybe not as comprehensive as in Estonia. For instance, they, in Czech Republic, the government-run banking system caused problems in the 1990s, while we basically had private banks and so on. But yeah, I mean, I guess also in comparison with some of the countries that were outside of the Soviet Union, but in the socialist bloc, we also had perhaps. We were starting also a little bit more like in a position of the blank sheet. We didn't have certain things. For instance, we didn't really have a proper banking system. Hence, all our banks in the 1990s were essentially startup companies. Hardo knows a lot about that. I mean, he worked for one of them, the most successful one, the Hansabank, that was later acquired by the Swedbank of Sweden. But yeah, sorry for taking so long, but I hope it helped. Thanks. Now I think others can comment more, so thank you.
Yeah, well, I'd like to. I agree with Meelis. What the important point was that it's changed in culture. That in the 90s the hero was entrepreneur. In the first decade of the last, and even now, the hero is someone who has found a quiet room in Brussels, and I think that's the. If one were to generalize that, it's the underlying driver of that culture change is or increase in risk aversion. That's the key driver here. And now, of course, with the COVID, this has the risk aversion has just skyrocketed. So I think this is general trend below the whole Western edifice.
One question we got. Oh, Niels, do you want to talk? If so, then you should unmute your mic.
From Vienna, I think, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I can add a little bit to your story there about Estonia. It was actually the case that Mark Lahr and other people in what we may call the central zone, you know. Small elite decision makers came to Stockholm and were educated in market economy, constitutionalism, and so on. At that very moment, you know, in the early 1990s. So there was a collaboration between classical liberals, actually, helping those people who, by skills and luck, I think, came into power there, you know. And it's quite astonishing, I think, to be a small country where you have a very small group of people, which they call a central zone. It's not the established elite, it's a new elite that came in here. They picked up the right ideas. And that has made a huge difference in the last, 20, 30 years. I visited Estonia a number of times in the early 1990s, and all the universities, all the social science faculties were all Marxist, so you had to wipe out those, you had to start anew. So there was an opportunity for new elites to emerge that came in with new ideas. And that opportunity was taken in Estonia. In some other countries, the old elites, the old communists took over again. That did not happen in the same way in Estonia. So it's a very interesting story that I think need to be told, this is the way to do it, I think, in general, to support some good people who can do the job,
That sounds great. Meelis, I was wondering, we got an audience question. If you look at Eastern Europe, there are many countries where you have sort of that backlash compared to the 1990s. And I mean, you kind of hinted that in Estonia, something's reversed as well. So I was like, the question is it in a similar way to how the situation, or could it develop into a similar way like it is in Hungary or Poland, or is it a very different type of backlash, more like a social democratic backlash, if you want, to more regulations and more taxes?
I mean, in a way, I already mentioned that I guess some of the backlash, has been about like maybe some of the reforms going too far. Maybe the good example here is about 20 years ago, since Nils also mentioned Mart Laar's party, they were in power in Tallinn. Mayor came from their party, and they privatized the Tallinn water company to the international water. And so we didn't just limit privatization to the companies that can operate in a more competitive market, but also we privatize some of the monopolies, basically utilities and so on. And quite interestingly, something like 10 years later, Minister of Economic Affairs from the same party, Mart Laar's party, was one of the main critiques of the actions of Tallinn Water Company, and basically said it was a bad idea, and that they had a whole election campaign built up on getting your home expenses under control, and the Tallinn Water Company is not letting people to do that. So my point is that it's not just like in the form of the new movements. We also have new movements. We have, for instance, more populist sort of party that is, I think, now ranked number 2 in the opinion polls, and it was in the previous government, that kind of reflects all the sort of anxieties that we can talk about, but also within some of the existing political parties, you can see this sort of paradigm shift quite radically, and the culmination of, I don't want to go into all the stories, but culmination of this story about the Tallinn Water Company is that just recently the city government decided to buy it back, basically. So now soon it will belong to the city as well. And ironically, the same investment bankers were advising them, who were also advising them 20 years ago when they privatized them. So I think that's you see those sort of paradigms. At the same time, I don't think we're going exactly in the direction of Hungary, whatever it might be. We still have a functioning multi-party system, which is quite competitive. And I don't see that one party is capable of consolidating, at least at the current system, it's capable of consolidating such a huge amount of power that Fidesz has done, which is also kind of ironic story because Viktor Orban, he studied at Oxford and he had lots of great ideas when he was a young man. He was more or less classical liberal. Fidesz was kind of more or less classical liberal organization in the early years, but it's a little bit like a similar story that it's not necessarily the new organizations or new groups that emerge, but you also see this sort of paradigm shift within existing organizations, and Fidesz has become, kind of scapegoat of liberalism. Thank you.
Okay. Nice, thanks. We got one question specifically for Niels, so be prepared for that. It's basically, would you say that there's a tendency for what you call benevolent, quote unquote, intervention to turn inexorably into the politically corrupt form of intervention? So is it actually, it's like a general tendency that if politicians want to do something nice, it will automatically become corrupted in a sense?
Yes, I think there's like a Gresham's law going on here, in politics, meaning that if you want to create something good with politics outside those basic fundamental rules and rights I discussed in the beginning, there's a tendency for other more self-interested groups that want to get privileges for themselves to enter the scene. So the larger the state becomes in terms of taxes, regulations, the more important and valuable is it, of course, for those other groups to intervene. And not least the business sector, it becomes more pro-business than pro-market, And if I should add something to what I think this discussion that Meelis has is very interesting, it's not only about markets either. It's about democracy, individual freedom, the free press that Hardo mentioned, I think those threats are in fact more dangerous in the longer run here. And it's very tempting for politicians to intervene here. And that we have seen in many countries actually during COVID-19. The economic intervention we have discussed quite a bit, but the limits on mobility, the limits on press and so on is just as severe, I would say. We don't have good indexes there, but the consequences will be serious, I think. Yeah.
That's true. There are no good indexes for...
My answer is yes to your question, yeah.
Good. That actually kind of is, I think, a good way of getting to Hardo and wondering, you kind of fear return to kind of 1980s political scenes. Would you say that it's actually that bad? And I mean, I'm saying that from a lockdown. Germany, which has been locked down for like 6 months. It's probably not that far-fetched anymore, but are you that pessimistic, or are you just saying that it's sort of getting slowly to that point?
Well, as I said, I had the intimations of that already 5 years ago. Whether I'm wrong or right is, of course, the open question. The fact that I feel something may tell as much as about me as about my surroundings. But obviously, the COVID situation has not helped the matter at all, I think. The way I see is that the present elite has been given a new lease of life, perhaps, with the COVID situation. And I think, we'll see how that thing plays itself out. Perhaps one of the most significant developments for me were, it's really the Brexit and Trump 2016 were the eye-openers, because that really showed me the impotency of the mainstream media to affect the course of affairs. That really showed to me the power of decentralized media. Whether this is good, again, whether this is good or bad, let's not discuss into that, or let's not discuss that here. But the most important thing here, I think, is the fundamental change in information technology, which is of the magnitude that we haven't seen since Gutenberg, and I think that's in that comparison, the 1980s made it sort of pale. My favorite example is that when I was a child, a youngster, we had just 2 TV channels. People in northern Estonia could watch TV, Finnish TV, and of course that, as Meelis also mentioned earlier, that has been one of the major factor in our sort of good start at the beginning of 90s. But people in the rest of Estonia just had 2 TV channels, and well, now I personally haven't watched TV for like 20 years anymore, and that gives you idea what I think of mainstream media. And I'm obviously not the only one here.
Yeah. Before we get to an end, I just wanted to ask Niels another question. Namely, you talked a lot about, and obviously that was the topic of today's discussion, unintended consequences, which is obviously a very big issue right now during the COVID situation. And you already hinted at it, how we've basically focused in the last year on one very specific issue, but didn't really look at the unintended consequences in other areas. I was wondering if you have any thoughts, because it definitely frustrates me a lot how people are very fixated at one specific issue while forgetting everything else. Why do they simply, I don't know if you have an answer to that, but why do people not care really about all of the economic, social, health side effects, unintended consequences, and all the other areas except COVID? Why is that not really being discussed, and what could we do about it?
I'm not sure that's true, actually. It's I think, as Hardo say, official media, politicians, they focus on the death rates, and all this. But for ordinary people, I think they're extremely frustrated of being locked into their homes, not being to go out at night, or not meeting their elderly, and so on and so forth. I think people are very much aware of these very dire consequences, and the question for the future is, of course, how those consequences will be handled. Will we be able to come back to a more normal situation, and how will that be done? And will we be able to decrease all those, emergency or measures that have been taken in many countries? It's I think it's quite a frustrating time. If you look at, I think Meelis was mentioning that Estonia has done fairly well. All Nordic countries have done well, Sweden as well. And they had very different strategies, but we have kept our economies open in contrast to the rest, I think, of Europe at least. And that has been very beneficial for our societies, and we will recover a lot faster. But I'm much more worried about Austria, for example, or Italy, or France, or Belgium, or the UK, and many other countries, where you have severe drops of GDP, and it will take a long time to create new jobs and get things started again. And those huge EU rescue programs and borrowed money for this and so on, that's a disaster. I'm very critical towards that. We need
good to hear.
Yeah, we need ideas here, and people like us have to be more out there and talk about this. That's my.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear that at least in Sweden, obviously things have fared quite differently. I think for a final question, which is for Meelis from the audience, which is something that I thought as well when you talked with when you had your introductory remarks. Now, seeing what has happened in the last year, also you mentioned that Estonia had sort of an offer that it could be Israel, or would turn out to be Israel. What is sort of the perception among Estonians now, having seen what happened in Israel? What is the perception vis-a-vis the EU and the membership to the EU? Because it seems to have been, you seem to have had an opportunity to go a very different route if, you know, all the solidarity, EU solidarity talk wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me to speak on behalf of all the Estonian people. I haven't actually looked at the recent opinion polls, and I don't know if the attitudes have changed. So in that sense, it's just like sort of my limited understanding. But my own understanding is that EU quite sort of mismanaged this vaccine situation. I mean, first, they don't really have the competence to deal with that type of issues. I mean, the health systems are usually sort of national. It's a national competence, and they maybe in the negotiations, instead of focusing on getting vaccines on the right time, they focused more on sort of other sort of issues that were maybe not as crucial. So I think in that sense, again, in one hand, yes, it would have been great if, for instance, Pfizer would have chosen Estonia as a sort of testing ground and sort of getting some patient data and so on. But on the other hand, obviously, being a small open economy, even if we are successful in that, it's not going. It's gonna be a really short-term kind of policy in a way, because I think on one hand, yes, I'm concerned about what happens in the European Union, but I'm much more concerned what happens around the world with vaccinations. Because if we really want to, go back to greater openness and so on, I think our policy goal should be to get as many people vaccinated around the world as quickly as possible. And we see some of the severe consequences now in India as a where India obviously also produce vaccines, but and is quite important player in this game. But I think also we shouldn't just focus on Europe. We should really focus on the world and getting as many countries as quickly as possible vaccinated.
Okay, very good. I think in that sense we should come to a close. We've already gone over 12 minutes longer than we should have. So thanks so much to the three of you for having joined us today. It was a somewhat depressing discussion, but that's not really your fault. I think that's the fault of the time we live in. Let's maybe stay optimistic. Who knows? Maybe we can all meet for the Free Market Roadshow in person next year again. I want to thank also our audience for joining us today. I also wanted to tell you about the next Free Market Roadshow event, which will take place, let me check, on May 3rd at 5 p.m. That's Central European Time, which is the Free Market Roadshow Stockholm. But again, it's all virtual, so it doesn't really matter all that much where you live. You can still check it out. The topic is intellectual property, brand protection, and patents, and the foundation of innovations. And if you want to check that out or any other Free Market Roadshow events, there are many of them, then go to the website www.freemarket-rs.com, and that would be great to see you all at a future event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.